I opened the door that evening expecting nothing more than the familiar stillness of the street, maybe the hum of a passing car or the rustle of leaves against the porch. Instead, I found her standing there, as if the night itself had delivered her to me. For a moment, I couldn't move. The steam from the mug of tea in my hand rose into the air, forgotten, my fingers clenching around the handle to keep from dropping it. She looked different from how I had pictured her in memory, sharper somehow, yet softer in ways that unsettled me. Time had carried her away from my imagination and returned her as a stranger and an echo all at once. Her eyes met mine without hesitation. They were steady, clear, and far too familiar for comfort. It felt like she had already crossed the threshold before her body even moved. I thought of the years that separated us, of my brother, of all the lines that had been drawn long ago, and yet nothing in that moment obeyed those lines. She was on my porch, close enough for the faint glow of the light above the door to sketch the angles of her face. The silence pressed down on me, heavier than any words could have been. The night around us was ordinary. The sound of distant traffic, the faint bark of a dog, the cool wind carrying the scent of damp earth. But none of that seemed real when measured against the sight of her standing at my door. Her presence absorbed every detail, every breath, every thought. I felt my skin prickle, as though my body understood something before my mind did. I wondered how many times she had thought of this, of standing where she was now, of looking at me like this. I remembered hearing about her years ago when she was still part of his life, back when her name came up in conversations that never lingered. She had been nothing more than a shadow then, a name tied to his stories, never mine. I thought of her as distant, irrelevant, a figure that belonged to someone else's world. Yet here she was, no longer a figure, but a reality, drawing me into the gravity of her presence. The thought of her past with him made my stomach twist, but it also sharpened the edge of curiosity that rose inside me. She shifted slightly on the porch, enough for her weight to creak against the wood, and the sound startled me in its intimacy. It was as though the house itself acknowledged her, granting her permission before I even had the chance to decide. I wanted to close the door, to protect the fragile order of my solitude, but I couldn't move. Something in me had already given way, long before my body could resist. Her figure in the doorway was both intrusion and invitation, and I felt my resolve unravel with each second that passed. The air between us was charged, though neither of us had spoken. My mind raced with reasons to send her away, but my body betrayed me, holding the door wide enough for her to step inside. The tea in my hand had gone cold, though I still clutched it like an anchor. I could feel the beat of my pulse in my wrists, in my throat, in the tips of my fingers. Her gaze flicked downward, catching the tremor I tried to hide, and in that glance, I sensed something dangerous. Recognition. She knew the effect she had, and she wasn't afraid of it. I became aware of my own house in ways I hadn't before. The faint scent of wood polish in the hallway, the uneven rug by the entrance, the framed photographs on the wall, all suddenly felt exposed under her eyes. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I realized that letting her in wouldn't just be about offering shelter, it would be about surrendering the small fortress I had built for myself. Yet the thought of her leaving, of turning and walking away into the night, made something inside me clench with an ache I didn't want to name. She didn't have to knock again or ask for anything. Her presence was the request, the demand, the inevitability. The way she stood, shoulders squared but eyes unguarded, told me she had come not by accident but by intention. I wanted to ask, to demand explanations, but the words dissolved before they could form. Instead, I found myself stepping back, creating space where there hadn't been any, a silent gesture that betrayed everything I thought I stood for. She moved forward with the quiet certainty of someone who already knew the answer. The moment she crossed the threshold, the air shifted. It wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniable. Her shadow merged with mine, the light spilling around her figure before the door closed behind us. I heard the click of the latch, final and deliberate, and it reverberated through me like a warning bell and a promise at once. My house was no longer mine alone. It now carried the weight of her presence, the history of my mother, and the unsettling possibility of something entirely new. I felt both invaded and chosen, and the contradiction left me trembling. As I turned to face her fully, I noticed how her expression held no apology. There was no hesitation in her stance, no uncertainty in her posture. She belonged to the moment, and by letting her inside, I had surrendered to it as well. My mind screamed at me about rules, boundaries, and consequences, but my body was silent, waiting, listening for what might come next. And in that silence, I understood that her arrival was not a passing event, but the beginning of something I couldn't yet define, something that already had its roots deep inside me. When she entered my house, everything I thought I knew about the space shifted. The familiar silence that had once comforted me was no longer the same. It was filled with her movements, the sound of her footsteps across the hardwood floor, the faint rustle of her jacket as she set it aside. Even the air seemed to change. It carried the trace of her perfume, subtle and lingering, wrapping itself around my senses. I walked through the hallway after her and felt as though each object I passed, each framed photograph, each lamp, each chair, was being redefined under the weight of her presence. I tried to remind myself of who she had been. She was not a stranger, not entirely, though I had never truly known her. She was part of a past that belonged to someone else, tethered to my brother's life, not mine. I remembered fragments. Her name said casually over the phone, her laughter in the background when I had spoken to him years ago, a photograph glimpsed once on his dresser. Those details were faint and dusty, and yet now they stood in sharp contrast to the woman moving through my living room with deliberate grace. The dissonance between memory and reality unsettled me deeply. I told myself to remain detached, to keep her at arm's length. But that resolve dissolved the moment she sat on my couch. She leaned back, folding one leg under herself, and looked so at ease that it was as though she had always belonged here. The fabric of the cushions molded around her, reshaping what had been my solitary refuge into something new, something shared. I stood in the doorway longer than necessary, unable to step inside, watching her claim the space with nothing more than her quiet confidence. It felt invasive, but at the same time, it felt like a relief. The memories of my brother intruded in waves I couldn't control. I imagined him sitting beside her years ago, touching her hand, hearing her laughter in ways that were never meant for me. The thought made my chest tighten, but it also sharpened my awareness of her in the present moment. She was here with me, not with him. Her history with him was real, undeniable, but it was a history that no longer held her. Now she existed in my world, in my home, and the weight of that realization pressed down on me until it became almost unbearable. I sat across from her finally, clutching the cooled mug of tea I had carried in from the doorway like a shield. My fingers wrapped tightly around the ceramic as though it could protect me from what I felt rising inside. She glanced toward me briefly, and though no words passed between us, her eyes lingered in a way that felt like acknowledgement. It was as though she knew the questions in my mind, the conflict twisting my thoughts into knots. Her gaze didn't offer answers, but it made the questions louder, clearer, more insistent. The details of her unsettled me the most. The way her hair fell over her shoulder, catching the glow of the lamp. The subtle line of her jaw, the curve of her lips that seemed permanently caught between tension and softness. She shifted slightly, resting her arm along the back of the couch, and I felt an unfamiliar heat stir inside me. I had lived in this house for years without thinking of anyone else inhabiting it, and now I couldn't stop picturing her body in every corner, filling the emptiness with her presence. It was dangerous, but it was irresistible. I thought about what it meant for her to be here, to be near me in this way. She wasn't supposed to belong to my story. She had already belonged to his. Yet the more I watched her, the more I felt that those rules no longer applied. Time had severed their bond, and now she stood before me without those chains. I wanted to resist the thought that she could become part of my life, but the pull was stronger than logic, stronger than the warnings I repeated in my head. The air between us thickened with silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of possibility. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the ticking of the clock on the wall, and beneath it all, the rhythm of my own heart pounding too loudly. I imagined what it would feel like if she moved closer, if her hand reached across the space between us. The thought startled me, but it didn't fade. It grew, curling itself around my breath until it was impossible to ignore. I shifted in my chair, trying to steady myself, but the movement only drew her eyes back to me. They lingered again, not invasive, not demanding, but steady, as though she was waiting for me to accept something I wasn't ready to face. I felt exposed under her gaze, stripped of the careful composure I had carried for years. She was younger, connected to a past that should have made her untouchable, and yet the untouchable had never felt so close. My thoughts turned traitorous, imagining what it might mean if I let the boundary dissolve. The room felt smaller with each passing moment. My home had been my fortress, my safe ground, but with her in it, every wall seemed to close in, urging me to make a choice. I could feel the pull of the past pressing down on me, whispering that this was wrong, forbidden, impossible. But the weight of the present pushed harder, insisting that she was here, that she had crossed into my life for a reason I couldn't yet name. I sat there, trembling, caught between those two forces, knowing that something had already shifted beyond repair. I woke in the middle of the night with the strange sensation that the air in the room had thickened. The faint glow from the streetlight slipped through the blinds, casting pale stripes across the floor. My body felt restless, as if it had been waiting for something, though I had no idea what. The sheets clung to my skin with a warmth that seemed unfamiliar, heavy with an anticipation I could not explain. For a long moment, I lay still, listening to the silence, until I realized I was not alone in it. I sensed her presence before I turned my head. The quiet rhythm of her breath, steady and unhurried, filled the room with a pulse that was not my own. She was closer than I expected, close enough that the rise and fall of her chest seemed to reach into my own breathing. I had not invited her into this space, not explicitly, yet she was there, her nearness pressing against the fragile boundaries I had kept intact for so long. The realization tightened something inside me, a coil of tension that vibrated through my veins. Her hand shifted across the sheets, the fabric whispering softly under her touch. It was such a small movement, but it felt monumental, as though the entire room tilted with it. Slowly, deliberately, her fingers brushed against my thigh, the contact so faint it could have been imagined, but it was not imagined. The warmth lingered, spreading through me like an unspoken confession. I held my breath, afraid to move, afraid to break the fragile line she had dared to cross. The silence between us grew louder. Every second stretched, heavy with meaning, filled with the unacknowledged truth that had been circling us since the moment she entered my home. I could feel my heart racing, its rhythm uneven and reckless. A part of me wanted to shift away, to reclaim the safety of distance, but my body betrayed me. I remained still, allowing the weight of her touch to anchor me to the bed, to the moment, to her. The boundary I had told myself was unbreakable was dissolving under her fingertips. Her breathing changed, deeper now, carrying with it the sound of intent. I felt her lean closer, her body radiating heat that reached me before her skin did. The space between us disappeared slowly, inch by inch, until I could sense the shape of her without opening my eyes. When her lips brushed against my shoulder, it was no longer possible to deny what was happening. The contact was gentle, almost reverent, but it set off sparks that rippled through me with dangerous clarity. I turned my face slightly toward her, not enough to meet her eyes, but enough to allow the scent of her hair to reach me. It was warm, clean, and unmistakably hers, and it filled me with a hunger I had not allowed myself to feel in years. Her hand pressed more firmly against my thigh, fingers curling slightly, as though seeking permission without words. I didn't stop her. I didn't move away. I let her claim that space, because deep down, I wanted her to. The sheets shifted as she moved closer, her body molding against mine in a way that felt inevitable. I could feel the softness of her chest against my back, the slow drag of her breath along my neck. My skin burned under every point of contact, the contrast of heat and chill leaving me dizzy. I thought of all the reasons this should not be happening, but none of them carried weight against the reality of her body pressing into mine. The rules of the past seemed flimsy now, unable to stand in the face of this moment. Her lips trailed lower, leaving a faint line of heat across my shoulder and down toward the curve of my back. My hand clenched in the sheets, desperate to ground myself, but all I could feel was her. Every inch of me was alive with sensation, as if I had been waiting years for a touch I didn't even know I craved. I wanted more, though I could not admit it aloud. The silence between us was too sacred to shatter with sound. Her fingers moved higher, brushing against my waist, lingering just beneath the edge of my shirt. The fabric lifted slightly, her touch now grazing bare skin, sending a shiver that made my whole body tremble. I closed my eyes tighter, surrendering to the truth I could no longer deny. There was no innocence left in these movements, no room for excuses. Each touch was deliberate, heavy with the weight of choices that could not be undone. When her arm finally circled around me, pulling me closer, my body responded instinctively. I pressed back against her, giving her the answer she had been waiting for without speaking it. Her breath caught against my neck, and I felt the shift in her as clearly as if it had been my own. In that moment, we both knew there was no turning back. The night had swallowed every barrier, and what remained was only the raw pulse of desire. I lay there in her arms, my heart racing, my body burning, my thoughts dissolving into fragments. The room had become too small to contain what passed between us, and yet it was the only place that could hold it. Her touch no longer felt like intrusion, it felt like inevitability. Every trace of hesitation I had carried dissolved into the dark, leaving me bare, trembling, and wanting more than I dared to admit. The night returned to me with a kind of inevitability I could neither fight nor fully welcome. I moved through the day in a haze, aware of her presence in every corner of the house, but it was when the lights dimmed and silence fell that everything sharpened. My body remembered the weight of her hand, the warmth of her breath, the way boundaries had crumbled without a word. I felt restless, pacing rooms, as though I could outwalk the hunger that had taken root inside me. But no matter where I turned, I carried her with me. When she came closer that evening, the air thickened as though the house itself recognized what was about to unfold. I stood against the wall, my back pressed to the cool plaster, trying to steady myself. She approached with the quiet certainty of someone who already knew I would not resist. My pulse drummed in my ears, loud and insistent, but my body refused to step away. Every inch of me leaned forward, drawn to her like flame to oxygen. Her hand found mine, sliding it upward until it rested against the curve of her waist. The thin fabric of her shirt offered no barrier to the heat that radiated from her skin. I wanted to let go, to reclaim control, but my fingers curled tighter, holding her as though she might vanish if I didn't. She leaned into me, her chest pressed against mine, her breath hot against my cheek. The closeness was unbearable, and yet the only thing I craved. When her lips touched mine, the world dissolved. The kiss was not hesitant this time. It was demanding, unapologetic, a collision of want and confession. I opened to her instinctively, my mouth shaping itself to hers, my body igniting under the force of her hunger. Her hands roamed along my sides, pulling at the hem of my shirt, tracing lines that set my skin ablaze. Each movement stripped away more than fabric. It stripped away years of denial. The shirt lifted over my head, tossed aside without care, leaving me exposed beneath the dim light. I felt her eyes on me, heavy and consuming, and instead of shrinking under their weight, I burned brighter. She pressed me harder against the wall, her mouth trailing from my lips down my throat, tasting every inch as if memorizing me. I gasped when her teeth grazed my collarbone, the sharp edge sending a tremor racing through me. My hands tangled in her hair, desperate to anchor myself. Her fingers slid down, finding the waistband of my pants, tugging lightly, teasing the line between anticipation and surrender. My body arched into her touch, betraying me completely. I felt myself unravel with every press of her palm, every stroke of her fingertips. I wanted her to consume me, to leave nothing untouched, and the realization both terrified and thrilled me. There was no innocence left in what we were doing. It was raw, urgent, and real. She pulled back briefly, only to peel away the last layers of clothing that separated us. The cool air brushed over my skin, but it was quickly replaced by the heat of her body pressing against mine. Flesh to flesh, every nerve in me screamed awake. She kissed me again, slower this time, but deeper, her tongue moving with a rhythm that mirrored the sway of her hips. My hands traced the length of her spine, pressing her closer, needing her to erase the space between us. We moved together with an intensity that made the world blur. Her hands explored me with a hunger that felt both reverent and reckless. I felt her grip my thigh, pulling it upward around her waist, forcing me to open wider for her body against mine. The friction made me cry out, a sound that startled me in its desperation. She silenced it with another kiss, swallowing every broken breath, every tremor of need. When she shifted, lowering her mouth to my chest, I thought I might lose control completely. The warmth of her lips, the wet trace of her tongue, the soft graze of her teeth. It was too much and never enough. I arched into her, my nails digging into her shoulders, begging without words for her not to stop. She obeyed with a devotion that made me tremble, worshiping every curve and hollow of my body until I was shaking with the weight of sensation. My release came suddenly, ripping through me with a force I couldn't contain. I clung to her, my body collapsing into hers, my breath jagged and uneven. She held me through it, steady and grounding, even as her own body trembled with restraint. I felt her desire thrumming against me, urgent and undeniable, and without hesitation, I reached for her, pulling her down into the same storm she had unleashed in me. Her cries echoed mine, raw and unfiltered, filling the room with proof of what we had become. The rhythm of her body against my hand, the slick heat of her unraveling beneath my touch, seared itself into me. I watched her break open, beautiful and devastating, and in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. The fire we had lit would not burn out. It would consume everything. When we collapsed together, tangled and damp with sweat, the silence that followed was louder than any confession. I lay with her against me, our hearts pounding in chaotic unison, the heat between us refusing to fade. I stared at the ceiling, chest rising and falling, knowing that what had happened was both a revelation and a ruin. The night had left me marked, not only on my skin, but in the core of who I was, and I understood with clarity that nothing in my life would ever be the same again. The days that followed carried a strange heaviness, as though the walls of my home had absorbed the memory of what had happened. I walked through each room with the feeling that shadows clung to me, whispering reminders I could not silence. Every corner seemed marked by us, every surface holding a trace of our bodies pressed too closely together. Even the sunlight that streamed through the windows felt altered, less innocent, as if it had become complicit in what we had done. The house was no longer just mine. It had become a witness, and I could not escape its gaze. She moved through the space as if she belonged, and that unsettled me more than anything. Her clothes hung from the back of chairs, her hairbrush sat on the bathroom counter, her scent lingered in the sheets long after she left the bed. I told myself it was temporary, a passing storm that would dissolve in time, but with each day her presence grew heavier. I watched her move from room to room and felt my chest tighten, torn between pride that she was here and dread that I no longer recognized the boundaries of my own life. The house had begun to echo with her footsteps, and those echoes stayed long after she had gone to sleep. At night, the silence returned, but it was no longer the silence of solitude. It was a silence filled with tension, with unspoken questions, with a restless current that hummed beneath every shadow. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, watching faint outlines shift as the headlights of passing cars cut through the blinds. The shadows moved across the walls like reminders of things I could not name, stretching long and then vanishing, only to return again. I wondered if she too lay awake, feeling the same heaviness pressing against her chest, or if the night held her more gently than it held me. I tried to pretend that things were unchanged, but my body betrayed me with every glance I stole in her direction. I noticed the way her shirt slipped from one shoulder when she leaned over the counter, the delicate line of her neck when she tilted her head back to laugh, the curve of her hips as she walked down the hall. These details became obsessions, magnified by the quiet of the evenings. I felt consumed by a hunger that was both exhilarating and suffocating, a hunger that turned even the most mundane moments into sparks waiting to catch fire. The shadows on the walls were not only hers, they were mine, cast large and unrelenting. Sometimes I caught her watching me too. Her eyes would linger a second longer than necessary, her lips parting slightly, as though she had been about to speak but thought better of it. Those fleeting looks left me shaken, my stomach tightening, my thoughts unraveling. The knowledge that she saw me, really saw me, made me feel both exposed and cherished in a way I had never known. Yet beneath that warmth was an unease, a reminder that she had belonged to someone else first. The shadow of my brother lingered like a stain, and no amount of intimacy could fully erase it. I began to notice how her presence disrupted the rhythm of my days. Tasks that once felt simple, making coffee, folding laundry, reading a book, now carried new meaning when she was near. I would reach for a mug and remember her lips pressed to mine, or touch a sweater and recall her body pressing into me. The shadows of our nights together bled into daylight, distorting the edges of ordinary life. I felt as though I were moving through a dream where reality and memory intertwined so tightly they could not be separated. Even when I tried to focus on practical things, my body remembered, pulling me back into the intensity we had unleashed. The mirror in my bedroom became a stranger. I would stand before it and see myself differently, not as the woman I had always been, but as someone marked by desire she could no longer deny. I traced my own collarbone with my fingers and thought of her mouth against it, thought of the bruises her lips had left, faint but undeniable. My reflection looked back at me with a hunger I did not recognize, as though another version of myself had stepped forward, one who cared little for consequences. The shadows in the room seemed to lean closer when I looked at myself that way, darkening, waiting. There were moments when I wanted to run, to push her out and reclaim the solitude I had once held so tightly, but the thought of her absence made my skin ache. The idea of her leaving filled me with a hollow dread, as though the walls of the house would collapse without her. I realized then that I was no longer free. I had bound myself to her without agreement, without words, without even the safety of reason. The shadows on the walls reminded me of this truth, stretching long and endless, showing me how far I had already gone. At night, when I lay beside her, the weight of it all pressed hardest. Her hand would brush against mine, or her breath would graze my shoulder, and the shadows would rise again, shifting across the ceiling. I felt both possessed and abandoned in those moments, as though I belonged to her but had lost some vital part of myself. I would close my eyes, trying to find stillness, but the memories of her hands, her mouth, her body would return, relentless and demanding. The shadows offered no mercy. They reminded me that once a line is crossed, it cannot be uncrossed. I came to understand that the shadows were not just tricks of light, not just fleeting shapes on the walls. They were the reflection of the choices I had made, the desires I had unleashed, the hunger that had taken root inside me. They followed me everywhere, shifting with me, clinging to me, whispering of what I had done and what I would do again. No matter how I tried to escape, they stayed, pressing their truths into me until I could no longer pretend. The shadows had become a part of me, and in their dark shapes I recognized a truth I could not speak aloud. I was no longer who I had been, and I never would be again. The night that ended it began like all the others, quiet and unremarkable on the surface. The house was dim, the only light coming from the lamp in the corner of the living room, where we had spent so many evenings together. The air carried the same heavy mixture of her perfume and my unease, but something about it felt final, like the last note of a song that lingered too long. I felt restless, pacing from one end of the room to the other, while she moved with calm assurance as though she already knew where the night was headed. My body ached with the knowledge that there was no turning back. When she appeared in the doorway of my bedroom, she carried something that twisted my stomach. Draped loosely over her body was one of my brother's old shirts, worn thin with time, unmistakable in its familiarity. I recognized it instantly, the faded fabric that had once hung from his shoulders, now clinging to her frame in ways it never had before. My breath caught, the sight both obscene and hypnotic, filling me with a wave of revulsion and desire so sharp it left me trembling. I should have turned away, but my eyes refused to release her. She stepped closer, the fabric brushing her thighs, the buttons undone just enough to expose the curve of her collarbone, the swell of her chest. The shirt was too large, yet on her it became something indecently intimate. Each movement she made sent the material shifting, exposing glimpses of skin that seemed even more forbidden because of the history stitched into that fabric. I felt the weight of my brother's memory pressing against me, colliding with the heat that rose in my body until I could hardly breathe. The contradiction tore at me, but I couldn't resist it. When she reached for me, I didn't move away. Her hand closed around mine, guiding it to rest against the front of the shirt, pressing my palm flat against the fabric stretched over her chest. The faint beat of her heart throbbed beneath both the cotton and my skin, pulling me deeper into a place I didn't want to go. My fingers curled instinctively, clutching her, feeling the warmth of her body through the barrier of cloth that carried another man's history. Shame and desire coiled together inside me, indistinguishable now, impossible to separate. She kissed me, and I let her. Her mouth tasted of certainty, of possession, of something I didn't want to admit I craved. As she pressed me backward onto the bed, the shirt shifted, slipping open to reveal her body beneath. I should have pushed her away, but instead I pulled her closer, burying my face against the fabric that should have repelled me. The scent of laundry detergent mixed with the faint ghost of memory, and I inhaled it as though it were oxygen. The sensation was filthy, intoxicating, irresistible. Her body moved against mine, the shirt tangling between us as we pressed together. The fabric rasped against my skin, a reminder with every motion that this was not just her. It was him. It was the past. It was everything I should never have allowed. But instead of breaking me, it drove me harder into her, each thrust of desire more violent in its desperation. I clutched at the shirt, pulling at it, twisting it, as if by holding on to it I could anchor myself to the storm that consumed us both. My shame deepened, but so did my pleasure. She trailed kisses down my chest, her hair falling forward, brushing against my skin. The shirt slid over me like a second set of hands, cold and hot at once, amplifying every sensation. I arched into her mouth, my nails digging into her shoulders, my body betraying every shred of reason I had left. The more I tried to deny what it meant, the more my body gave itself to her. Each cry that escaped my lips felt like a confession, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. When she pushed me over the edge, it was with a ferocity I hadn't known I was capable of. My body shattered beneath her, every nerve burning, every thought obliterated. And when I opened my eyes, the first thing I saw was that shirt, damp now with sweat, clinging to her body as though it belonged there. The sight of it sent another shudder through me, not of release, but of realization. I had not only surrendered to her, I had surrendered to everything that shirt represented. Afterward, we lay tangled in silence, the fabric still between us. My hand rested against her stomach, but my fingers clutched the hem of the shirt, unable to let go. I stared at it, my mind spinning, my chest heaving, knowing I had crossed into a place I could never explain. The shame should have crushed me, but instead it throbbed like another form of desire. I closed my eyes, pressing my face against her, and let it consume me. The room was dark, except for the faint shadows crawling across the walls. The bed smelled of sweat, of skin, of something unbearably human. I knew then that there would be no undoing this, no way to strip the memory clean. What we had done was not just desire. It was corruption, twisted and permanent, carved into me with every breath I took. I felt unrecognizable to myself, a stranger who could no longer hide behind the safety of restraint. The night ended, not with tenderness, but with the heavy certainty of what I had allowed. I remained awake long after she drifted into sleep, her body warm against mine, the shirt still clinging to her like a silent witness. I stared into the dark, my chest tight, my skin burning, my thoughts caught between disgust and craving. The truth was stark, unavoidable. I didn't want to stop. Even as the weight of it pressed down on me, I knew I would let it happen again, and that knowledge was the most damning thing of all.